You're watching Northern Crimes.
I've been telling stories about cold cases in the Pacific Northwest for a long time now. I live in Alaska, and there's no shortage of dark stories to cover here. But there's something about the Pacific Northwest, that is, British Columbia, Washington, Oregon, that's always fascinated me. Maybe it's the remote highways winding through endless stretches of mountain terrain. Maybe it's the millions of acres of Douglas fir and western hemlock. Maybe it's the region's legacy of some of the most terrifying serial killers of all time. Whatever it is, I'm drawn back again and again and again. So today, we're looking at 6 cases I uncovered in the Pacific Northwest Cold Case Archives. Some you may have heard of, others are definitely more under the radar, but what they all share are chilling circumstances, disturbing twists and turns, and an unnerving sense of the unknown. This is Northern Crimes. Tacoma, Washington, August 31st, 1961. The Pacific Northwest in late August is usually a place of transition, but on this particular night, a savage summer storm was howling through the Puget Sound. Heavy rain lashed against the windows, and the wind was fierce enough to knock out power grids across Tacoma. Inside a home on North 14th Street, 8-year-old Anne-Marie Burr went to sleep in her blue nightgown. She was a blonde, sweet-faced girl who wore a tiny silver chain necklace featuring medals of St. Christopher and the Madonna. Sometime during the dark, chaotic morning hours, the storm provided the perfect cover for a predator. At 5:30 a.m., Anne-Marie's mother, Beverly, went to wake her daughters. Anne-Marie's bed was empty. Downstairs, the front door was standing ajar. In the living room, a window that had been cracked open just a few inches to let a TV antenna wire through was now wide open. Outside, a heavy garden bench had been dragged from the yard and placed directly beneath the sill. Anne-Marie had vanished into the rain. The search that followed was, at the time, the largest in Tacoma's history. Hundreds of soldiers from Fort Lewis, National Guard members, and scuba divers combed a 75-square-block radius. They searched construction sites, wooded ravines, and the dark sewer outfall pipes emptying into Commencement Bay, but the storm had washed the city clean. To make things worse, the physical evidence was agonizingly sparse. Detectives found a single red thread snagged on the brick facade outside the window, a few blades of grass tracked onto the living room floor, and a faint muddy footprint from a sneaker near the overturned bench. The shoe was estimated to be size 6 or 7, too small for most grown men. Strangely, a table covered in fragile glass figurines sitting right inside the open window hadn't been disturbed. Whoever came through that window was small, agile, and terrifyingly precise. Decades passed, and local leads withered. Neighborhood teenagers were questioned, door-to-door salesmen were tracked down, and the family lived in a state of suspended animation. They stayed in the house for 6 years and kept the same phone number for decades, praying for a voice on the other end. Then, the case transitioned from a local tragedy to a piece of national infamy. Investigators began looking closely at a 14-year-old high school student who lived just 3 miles away. His name was Ted Bundy. In 1961, Bundy was known as a peeping Tom and shoplifter in the neighborhood. His morning newspaper delivery route ran right past the Burr home, He was a teenager who wore a size 6 sneaker, and he frequently visited a great-uncle who taught at the university just blocks away. Years later, on death row in Florida, Bundy played a cruel game of cat and mouse with investigators. He explicitly denied killing Anne Marie in letters to her grieving mother, yet he whispered a very different story to a prison psychologist. Bundy confessed that his very first victim was an 8-year-old girl he kidnapped in Tacoma, a girl he said he buried in a, quote, muddy pit near the local university. To Detective Robert Keppel, Bundy muttered that there were some murders he would, quote-unquote, never talk about because they were simply too close to home. In 2011, forensic scientists attempted to extract DNA from the decades-old evidence to see if it matched Bundy's profile. But time in the damp Pacific Northwest air had done the damage. The samples were far too degraded, and the results came back inconclusive. Donald and Beverly Burr both passed away in the 2000s, taking their broken hearts to the grave without ever knowing what happened to their daughter. Anne Marie's name remains on an open missing persons file in Tacoma. It stands as a chilling prologue to a lifetime of horror. A reminder that before a monster becomes a household name, he's just a quiet teenager living 3 miles down the road, waiting for a storm. Duncan, British Columbia, November 29th, 1980. The dense, moss-draped forests of Vancouver Island are no strangers to strange sights. But the town of Duncan has a unique reputation. Labeled a UFO hotspot ever since a highly publicized 1970 sighting of a domed aircraft outside the local hospital, the valley seemed to look toward the sky more than most. And for 32-year-old Granger Taylor, that sky held an answering voice. Granger was an undisputed mechanical genius. Despite dropping out of school after the 8th grade, he was an industrial wizard. He rebuilt bulldozers professional mechanics had abandoned, single-handedly restored a vintage steam locomotive, and brought a rusted World War II P-40 Kitty Hawk fighter plane back to pristine flying condition. He was a gentle giant, quiet, stocky, and brilliant. But as the 1980s approached, his focus shifted from the past to the future. On his parents' farm, he constructed a life-size replica of a flying saucer out of 2 satellite dishes, outfitting it with a television, a couch, and a stove. He told friends he was receiving telepathic communications from extraterrestrials. They were coming for him, he said. He just needed the right night. That night arrived on November 29th, 1980, during what meteorologists would call the quote-unquote storm of the century. Torrential rain and violent winds hammered down on the Pacific Northwest. Granger ate a quiet dinner at a local grill, refusing to wear a coat despite the freezing storm. He visited his young protege one last time, confirming the aliens were indeed arriving that night. When his parents woke up the next morning, Granger was gone. Taped to their bedroom door was a letter written in his steady hand. Dear Mother and Father, I've gone away to walk aboard an alien spaceship, as recurring dreams assured a 42-month interstellar voyage to explore the vast universe, then return. I'm leaving behind all my possessions to you as I will no longer require the use of any. For over 5 years, Granger's disappearance was treated as a modern ghost story. Some believed the genius had actually left. Others suspected a severe mental break, possibly exacerbated by heavy daily use of LSD, which his siblings later claimed he was consuming. The mystery took a violent turn in March 1986. Deep in the woods of Mount Prevost, forestry workers stumbled on a huge blast site. The explosion had been catastrophic, leaving a 300-foot debris field. An engine block was thrown 100 feet, a tire rim was wedged 60 feet in a tree. Scattered amidst the metal were fragments of a Datsun pickup truck, pieces of a wool sweater, and human bone fragments. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police officially closed that file, concluding that Granger had been carrying dynamite in his truck, a common tool for his salvage work, and it had detonated either by tragic accident or intentional suicide. Yet for those who knew Granger best, the official story has always been a poor fit. His protege pointed out glaring discrepancies. The truck wreckage found on the mountain was blue, but Granger's truck was famously Pepto-Bismol pink. DNA testing didn't exist in 1986, meaning the bone fragments were never definitively identified. Furthermore, the farm's supply of dynamite appeared completely untouched after he vanished. Did Granger Taylor succumb to a psychological crisis under the cover of the storm, blowing himself apart on a lonely mountainside? Or did a man with a mind too large for this world find a way to leave it behind? Today, the old steam train he restored still sits at the BC Forest Discovery Center, a monument to a mechanical savant who built a spaceship in his backyard, wrote a deadline into his goodbye note, and drove out into the worst storm of the century, never to come home again. Whitehorse, Yukon, May 2007. The Yukon in late spring is a land of relentless light, where the sun barely dips below the horizon and the wilderness seems to wake up all at once. In May 2007, 19-year-old Angel Karlik was preparing for a milestone that many thought she would never reach. A Cascadena First Nation woman, Angel had overcome housing instability and addiction to become a pillar of the Whitehorse youth community. She painted vibrant murals, mentored vulnerable kids, and had just earned her high school diploma. Her dream was simple: get a steady job, buy a home, and adopt her younger brother out of foster care. But as graduation celebrations swept through the northern city, Angel found herself caught in a dark undertow. Just days before she vanished, the RCMP questioned Angel regarding a brutal local crime, the assault and death of a 52-year-old homeless man named Colin Serenko. Rumors immediately rippled through her inner circle that Angel hadn't just heard about the attack, she'd witnessed it. On the weekend of May 26th, after calling a friend from a downtown payphone, Angel walked away from the main street flanked by two unidentified young men. She was never seen alive again. When Angel failed to show up to collect her paycheck, her mentors at the youth center sounded the alarm. But the initial response from law enforcement was plagued by a familiar friction. Because of her age and her past history of homelessness, the RCMP initially classified the prominent youth advocate as a runaway. That bureaucratic label cost investigators the critical first 48 hours, the vital window where tracks are fresh and memories haven't yet faded. 6 months later, the wilderness gave up its secret. A hiker walking through the dense brush of Pilot Mountain stumbled upon a shallow grave. Inside were Angel's severely decomposed remains. The half-year delay proved catastrophic for the forensic team. The pathologist was completely unable to determine how Angel died, and investigators couldn't even confirm if Pilot Mountain was the actual crime scene or merely a body dump. The trail had gone cold before the homicide investigation had even began. For 10 years, Angel's mother, Wendy Karlik, carried a sign and marched through the streets of Whitehorse, becoming a fierce voice for the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls movement. She demanded to know who silenced her daughter. But in a horrifying twist of generational trauma, the fight came to a sudden, bloody end. In April 2017, Wendy Karlik was found murdered inside a Whitehorse bungalow. While the police eventually caught Wendy's killer and determined the two cases were technically unrelated, the tragedy left the community reeling. The lead detective on Wendy's file was transferred to head a newly formed historical case unit, inheriting Angel's cold case file as well. Today, investigators believe the key to the mystery lies with the two unidentified men seen walking with Angel on the night she went missing. They're convinced that someone in the isolated Yukon interior is holding on to a 19-year-old secret. Angel's murals still decorate the walls of the Whitehorse Youth Center, and a homeless shelter named Angel's Nest stands as a monument to her dream. But the question remains carved into the northern landscape. Was a young woman on the cusp of a bright future executed simply because she saw something she wasn't meant to see? North Vancouver, British Columbia, August 10th, 1994. In the mid-1990s, Vancouver's Howe Street was a playground for high-stakes stock promoters, sudden fortunes, and cutthroat deals. Nick and Lisa Massey were right at the center of it. Nick was a sophisticated 35-year veteran of the Bank of Montreal who'd recently retired into the volatile world of international shell companies. His wife, Lisa, was a popular, stylish hairdresser. Together, they lived a lavish, jet-setting life, flying on private planes to Las Vegas boxing matches and dining at the city's most exclusive restaurants. But behind the facade, the Masseys were drowning. Their North Vancouver home was heavily mortgaged, and they were carrying tens of thousands of dollars in credit card debt. In the spring of 1994, their behavior took a sharp, secretive turn. They made an unannounced trip to the Cayman Islands to deposit $50,000 in stock and quietly drew up formal wills. Nick even called his daughter in Holland, cryptically warning her that he wouldn't be able to reach her for her upcoming birthday. He offered no explanation. The climax arrived on August 10th. Nick told business associates he was brokering a massive $10 million deal with a mystery investor. He claimed the investor was sending a limousine to pick them up for dinner at Trader Vic's, a famous tiki-themed lounge at the Westin Bayshore Hotel. That evening, the Masseys turned down an invitation to watch a local fireworks display, citing their big meeting. They were spotted late that evening at the Westin Bayshore Lounge, sharing a bottle of wine. Oddly, Nick was dressed in a casual jogging suit, hardly the attire for a multi-million-dollar banking negotiation. Strangely, no one ever showed up for the 4-person reservation at Trader Vic's, and no one called to cancel. The next morning, 2 brief phone calls were placed from Nick's cell phone to Lisa's boss and a business partner. Lisa's voice was on the line, calmly explaining that they were going to be out of town for a few days. The cell towers routed those calls through a repeater on Bowen Island, indicating the phone was somewhere along the rugged, isolated Sunshine Coast. And then, the phone went dead forever. A week later, Lisa's sister entered their home and walked into a baffling scene. The front door was unlocked, and the security alarm, which the couple used religiously, was disabled. Their beloved cat had been abandoned inside without food or water, yet their passports, wallets, and car were still at the house. On the ground outside the front door, investigators found a chilling detail: 2 plastic zip ties. The North Vancouver RCMP officially presumes the Masseys are the victims of a double homicide. Nick's financial dealings had connected him to controversial stock manipulators, and a prominent private investigator theorized that Nick may have crossed a line, inadvertently laundering drug money for a notorious motorcycle gang. The zip ties at the door suggested a swift, violent abduction. Yet, a second theory persists among the old Howe Street associates. They wonder if Nick used his deep, sophisticated knowledge of international banking to orchestrate the ultimate vanishing act, fleeing to a hidden life in the Caribbean. Decades later, the Masseys' bank accounts remain untouched, and their $50,000 reward goes unclaimed. The North Vancouver RCMP refuses to close the file. Whether they're living a shadow existence under the palm trees of the Caymans, or whether they were carried out of their home in zip ties, the Macees left behind a riddle that the gray waters of the Pacific Northwest refuse to answer. Puyallup, Washington, June 26, 1994. The dense evergreen forests of Pierce County are often shrouded in a low-hanging mist, creating an atmosphere that feels naturally secretive. In the summer of 1994, 25-year-old Michael Johnston and 19-year-old Rochelle Robinson found solace in those shadows. Michael was a married father of two from Puyallup, and Rochelle was a college student from Spanaway. Unknown to their families and social circles, the two were embroiled in an intense, clandestine, extramarital affair. They bonded over a shared, almost religious devotion to the fantasy card game Magic the Gathering and an interest in role-playing games. Michael in particular was fascinated by the occult, keeping a large collection of books on black magic. On the night of June 26th, the couple left a friend's house at 11:30 p.m. after a gaming session. They drove to a quiet road near the Tacoma Sportsman's Club to be alone. They had no idea they'd been followed. At 4:45 a.m. the next morning, a passerby spotted Rochelle's Mazda on a dark stretch of Canyon Road East. Lying next to the car was Michael Johnston. He'd been executed, forced to his knees, handcuffed, his throat slashed to the bone, and shot in the head at point-blank range. The crime scene was chaos. It was clear the couple had been caught by surprise and forced to dress hastily at gunpoint. When Rochelle's body was found 12 hours later, 5 miles away on a secluded access road, she was wearing Michael's t-shirt inside out. Rochelle's end had been even more agonizing. Her killer had used small knife pricks to her neck to coerce her before stabbing her repeatedly and slashing her throat. In a bizarre touch, the killer had covered her body with a large, commercial cardboard box used for high-quality printer paper, bearing the markings Gilchrist, Laid, India White. Forensics confirmed the killer had brought this box to the scene, likely having stored it in a garage or closet for years. The investigation by the Pierce County Sheriff's Department immediately fractured into wildly different theories. Because of the era, the quote-unquote satanic panic loomed large. A private investigator and a prominent psychic claimed the murders were ritualistic, suggesting Michael had crossed a local black magic cult that executed him for violating their rules. However, mainstream detectives viewed the occult angle as a distraction. They focused instead on the secret affair, looking closely at Michael's wife, who stood to inherit a $250,000 life insurance policy, and Rochelle's ex-boyfriend. Both were eventually cleared. The most terrifying lead, however, came from Rochelle's co-workers at Taco Bell. They revealed that for 3 to 4 months prior to the murder, Rochelle had been stalked by a customer. She even had reluctantly eaten lunch with him one time, and he became obsessed, following her home and loitering at her workplace. He was described as a white male in his late 20s with a noticeable slouch, driving a commercial truck that carried large panes of glass. Despite a suspect sketch and a $16,000 reward, the man from the glass company was never identified. Over 30 years later, the bullet recovered from Michael's head sits in an evidence locker, waiting for a matching weapon. Rochelle's mother describes the decades of waiting as kind of a merry-go-round of grief that offers no exit. In the Pacific Northwest, where fantasy games and real-world horrors occasionally blur, the paper box and the glass truck remain pieces of a puzzle that Pierce County detectives just can't solve. The killer walked out of the woods in 1994, leaving behind a tragic, real-world execution masked in the imagery of a dark ritual. Concrete, Washington, December 8th, 1997. The small town of Concrete sits deep in the Skagit River Valley, surrounded by the dense forests and jagged peaks of the North Cascades. In the winter, it's a place of bone-chilling dampness and long, dark mornings. On one such morning, in December 1997, the quiet of this rural enclave was shattered by a discovery in a gravel driveway along the Concrete Sauk Valley Road. Lying on the ground outside her home was 44-year-old Vicki Jo Dodds Silvas. She was a woman with deep roots in the Pacific Northwest and Alaska, a high school graduate from Juneau who'd moved down to the Washington wilderness. She had a son, a life, and a quiet routine, but someone had been waiting for her in the dark. The crime scene was instantly horrific. Forensic investigators determined that Vicki's life had been taken by an edged weapon, a weapon wielded with enough sudden catastrophic violence that she never made it out of her driveway. The Skagit County Sheriff's Office launched an exhaustive investigation under case number 97-11697. Detectives knocked on doors across the valley, interviewing dozens of potential witnesses, neighbors, and associates. They looked for a motive, a stalker, or a domestic dispute that had boiled over into a homicide, but every avenue of inquiry eventually hit a wall of absolute silence. Years turned into decades and the file grew cold. In a desperate bid for a breakthrough, the case was eventually presented to the Vidocq Society, an elite, exclusive organization of forensic experts, profilers, and criminologists who volunteer to dissect the nation's most complex unsolved homicides. These master investigators re-examined the autopsy reports and the crime scene photos, searching for a behavioral pattern or a missed clue left by the killer. Yet, even the greatest minds in forensic science couldn't crack the case. Today, Vicki Jo Dodds Silvas is a ghost in the digital age. Outside of law enforcement archives, there's an eerie lack of public information about her murder. Her online footprint is almost non-existent. No major media archives, no active forum discussions, and just a few photos. She's a victim fading into the gray mist of the Skagit Valley. But cold case advocates refuse to let her disappear completely. They're still searching for anyone who knew Vicki through school, sports, or social clubs. Anyone who might hold a photograph or a memory that could breathe life back into her case. In the Pacific Northwest, the rain can wash away a crime scene and time can bury a memory. But 30 years later, the question remains frozen in the winter air of Concrete. Who stepped outside of the dark on that December morning to ensure that Vicki Silvas would never leave her driveway alive? 6 stories, 2 states, a province, and millions of acres of unyielding wilderness. From the childhood neighborhood of Ted Bundy to a silent gravel driveway in Concrete, the archives of the Pacific Northwest remain a graveyard of unanswered questions. We can analyze the faded forensic threads, map the cell towers, and profile the stalkers. But the sheer vastness of this geography makes it difficult to find what doesn't want to be found. These files stay open because the physical evidence degrades, memories fade, and the terrain offers too many places for a secret to rest. But as the fog rolls back into the Douglas firs tonight, you have to wonder, is the truth truly buried out there in the woods, or is it still walking among us?